Miguel was just 7 when he asked a dying stranger on a park bench, "Are you okay?" That question unlocked a $5 million secret that changed everything. But what happened next will leave you speechless. Like, if you believe in kindness, subscribe for more inspiring stories and comment where you're watching from. William Chase pressed his palm against the cold metal armrest of the park bench, feeling the morning dew seep through his thin cotton shirt. His lungs burned with each shallow breath, the plastic tube under his nose delivering oxygen in measured hisses that reminded him of a clock counting down. 72 hours. That's what Dr. Patterson had said 3 days ago. His face grave behind wire-rimmed glasses. "I'm sorry, William. Your heart is failing. There's nothing more we can do." The sun hadn't fully risen over Riverside Park yet. Shadows still clung to the oak trees, their branches bare against the pale November sky. William had chosen this bench deliberately, the same one where his mother used to bring him as a boy, where she'd taught him to notice the small things. The way morning light filtered through leaves, the sound of sparrows arguing over breadcrumbs, the smell of rain before it fell. He adjusted the oxygen tank beside him, its weight both comforting and accusatory. $42 million in the bank, and he was dying alone on a park bench. Marcus Webb's voice echoed in his memory from yesterday's phone call. "You're making a mistake, William. That money belongs to the company, to the shareholders, to people who've actually earned it." William had hung up without answering. Marcus didn't understand. Nobody did. A shuffle of worn sneakers on gravel interrupted his thoughts. William looked up to see a boy approaching. No more than 7, maybe 8 years old. His school uniform was clean but faded. The blue polo shirt too large, sleeves rolled up several times to reveal thin wrists. The boy's backpack hung from one shoulder, its zipper broken and held together with a safety pin. "Are you okay, mister?" The question hit William like a physical blow. When was the last time anyone had asked him that? Not his doctors, not his lawyers, not Marcus. They asked about his affairs, his will, his mental capacity, but never about him. William studied the boy's face. Dark eyes, earnest and unguarded, a spray of freckles across brown skin. Something about the tilt of his head, the shape of his jaw, sent a jolt through William's chest that had nothing to do with his failing heart. "I'm managing," William said, his voice rougher than intended. "Shouldn't you be heading to school?" The boy glanced at a plastic watch on his wrist, the kind that came in cereal boxes. "I walk through the park every morning. I've seen you here the last 2 days. You look sad." Children's honesty. William had forgotten how piercing it could be. "What's your name?" William asked, though he already knew. Had known since that terrible night 8 months ago when Sarah had whispered the truth with her dying breath. Miguel Santos." The boy shifted his backpack. "Do you come here a lot?" "First time in 40 years, William admitted. The irony wasn't lost on him. Returning to die where he'd learned to live. "I used to come here with my mother." Miguel nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense. "My mum died. Car accident. I live with my grandpa George now." William's throat tightened. He knew about the accident, had paid for Sarah's funeral from a distance, anonymously, through layers of legal intermediaries, had held the DNA test results in his trembling hands and wept for the 8 years he'd wasted choosing ambition over love. For the son he'd never know. "I'm sorry about your mother," William said, and meant it with every fiber of his deteriorating heart. Miguel shrugged, a gesture that tried for casual but couldn't quite hide the weight beneath. "Grandpa says she's watching over us. Do you think that's true?" Before William could answer, Miguel unzipped his broken backpack and pulled out something wrapped in napkin. "I only have 1 cookie today, but we can share. Grandpa says sharing makes things taste better." He held out half a corn cookie. "Biscoito de maicena." William stared at it, paralyzed. Sarah's favorite. She used to buy them at the Brazilian bakery on 5th Street. Dunking them in coffee while she studied for nursing exams at his apartment, back when they were young and stupid and thought love alone could solve everything. William took the cookie with unsteady fingers. "Thank you, Miguel." The boy sat down beside him. leaving a respectful distance, but near enough that William could smell the faint scent of cheap laundry soap and childhood, that indefinable mixture of playground dust and curiosity. Miguel bit into his half of the cookie, legs swinging beneath the bench, sneakers scuffed beyond recognition. "You should come back tomorrow," Miguel said between bites. "The birds are really cool in the morning. There's this red one that sounds like it's laughing." William's chest constricted, oxygen suddenly insufficient, despite the steady flow from the tank. Tomorrow, the boy believed in tomorrows with such casual certainty. "I'd like that," William heard himself say across the park. A man in a maintenance uniform hurried past, probably late for work. William watched him disappear down the path and thought of George Santos. 3 jobs. Raising his grandson alone, probably counting every dollar, every meal, every minute. A better man than William had ever been. Miguel finished his cookie and stood, brushing crumbs from his uniform. "I have to go now, Mrs. Patterson doesn't like when we're late." He paused, then stuck out his hand with unexpected formality. "It was nice to meet you, Mr. William." He shook the small hand, feeling the warmth of it, the aliveness. "Just William." "Okay, just William, see you tomorrow." The boy ran off toward the park exit, backpack bouncing, one shoelace untied. William watched until he disappeared around the corner, then looked down at the half-eaten cookie in his palm. Crumbs dusted his fingers like evidence. In his jacket pocket, his phone buzzed, probably Marcus again, or Richard Morrison with more papers to sign. William ignored it. Instead, he pulled out the photograph he'd been carrying for 8 months, Sarah, 7 months pregnant, laughing at something off camera. He'd taken this photo on their last good day together. Before ambition and pride had ruined everything. "I see him, Sarah," William whispered to the morning air. "He has your eyes, your kindness." A cardinal landed on the bench's backrest, tilting its head as if eavesdropping. Miguel's red bird, probably. It sang 3 clear notes, then flew away toward the rising sun. William closed his eyes and let the autumn cold seep into his bones. 72 hours, Dr. Patterson had said. But William Chase had just been given something infinitely more valuable than time. He'd been seen. George Santos's alarm clock screamed at 4:30 a.m., the sound drilling through his skull like it did every morning. He slapped it silent and lay in the darkness of the studio apartment, listening to Miguel's soft breathing from the pull-out sofa across the room. The boy slept, curled into himself, one thin arm hanging off the edge. Still clutching the pencil he'd fallen asleep with while doing homework, the weight in George's chest never went away anymore. It sat there constant, heavy as the 3 jobs that kept them barely afloat. Heavier than the medical bills from Sarah's accident that still arrived like clockwork. He was 62 years old and felt 80. His back screamed when he bent to tie his work boots. His hands shook when he counted change for the bus. But Miguel needed breakfast. Miguel needed school supplies. Miguel needed a future that didn't look like this. George moved quietly, years of practice making him nearly invisible in the small space. He left a note on the kitchen counter, same note as always, different day. "Good morning, mijo. Cornflakes in cabinet. Lock door when you leave. Be good. Love you." Vovo, the hospital, waited for him at 5 a.m. sharp. 3 hours of mopping floors, emptying bedpans, scrubbing bathrooms that smelled like death and disinfectant. The fluorescent lights hurt his eyes. The other cleaners nodded silent greetings, too tired for conversation. They were all the same. Immigrants, elderly, desperate, invisible people cleaning up after visible ones. George's supervisor, a pinched woman named Mrs. Chen, inspected his work with the enthusiasm of someone looking for mistakes. She found none, she never did. George Santos might be poor, but he wasn't sloppy. "Bathroom 4 needs another pass," she said anyway, because she always said something. "Yes, ma'am." At 1 p.m. he clocked out and walked 40 minutes to the supermarket for his second shift. The security guard uniform was too tight across his shoulders, the polyester making him sweat, even in November. He stood by the entrance, watching people come and go with full carts, thinking about the expired yogurt the manager let him take home sometimes. The bruised fruit they couldn't sell. His feet throbbed, his stomach growled. He ignored both. At the apartment building where they rented a room from Mrs. Lourdes, Miguel was already home from school. George could see it in the way his homework was half finished, in the new drawing taped to the wall, stick figures holding hands under a yellow sun. The boy had eaten the cornflakes, had locked the door like asked, had maybe been a little bit lonely, but George couldn't fix that. "How was school?" George asked, his voice rough from disuse. Miguel looked up from his math worksheet, eyes bright. "Good. I got a gold star in reading. And guess what, Vovo? I made a new friend." Something in George's chest loosened. "Yeah, what's his name?" "William. He's really nice. He sits in the park every morning and he's sad, but I shared my cookie with him and he smiled." George's hand froze on the refrigerator handle. "Miguel, what do you mean, a man in the park?" The boy's enthusiasm dimmed slightly, sensing danger. "He's old, Vovo, like you. He's sick. He has one of those breathing machines. I just said hello." Every instinct George possessed fired at once. Strange men, Parks, his 7-year-old grandson. "Miguel Santos, you do not talk to strangers, do you understand me?" "But he's not a stranger anymore. He's William." "No!" George's voice came out harder than intended. "You stay away from him. You hear me?" Miguel's face crumpled. "But he's lonely, Vovo. Like how you get lonely when you think I'm not looking." The observation landed like a punch. George sat down heavily at their small table, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. How did you explain the world's cruelty to someone who still believed in sharing cookies? "It's not safe," George said finally. "I need you to promise me." Miguel stared at his shoes. "Okay, Vovo." But George knew that tone, knew the way his grandson's jaw set, just like Sarah's used to. The boy would go back, of course he would. Miguel had inherited his mother's stubborn compassion, that dangerous belief that kindness could fix broken things. At 9 p.m., George started his third shift, delivering pizzas for sales. The smell of grease and cheese turned his stomach, but the tips kept the lights on. He drove his ancient Honda through neighborhoods that ranged from struggling to desperate, watching people's faces when he arrived at their doors. Some tipped well, some didn't tip at all. Some looked at him like he was furniture. He got home at 11:30, too tired to eat, too wired to sleep. Miguel was already in bed, breathing the deep rhythm of childhood dreams. George stood in the doorway watching him, this small person who was his entire world, and felt the crushing weight of inadequacy. The next morning, George followed Miguel to school, stayed far back, hidden, watched as his grandson detoured through Riverside Park, watched as he approached an elderly man on a bench with an oxygen tank. The man's face when he saw Miguel, George saw it even from a distance, saw the way the man's entire body changed, softened, came alive, saw the way Miguel sat down like they'd known each other forever. George moved closer, keeping to the trees close enough to hear fragments. "And my teacher said my drawing was really good. Used to draw too when I was young. Is that bird the red one you mentioned?" The man wasn't touching Miguel, wasn't doing anything wrong, just sitting there listening with the kind of attention George himself could barely manage anymore through his exhaustion. Something about the man's profile nagged at George's memory, something familiar he couldn't quite place. When Miguel ran off toward school, George stepped out of his hiding spot. The man on the bench looked up, startled, and George saw his face clearly for the first time. William Chase. George had seen that face in the newspapers over the years, the business section, the society pages, CEO of Chase Industries, worth millions, and now dying on a park bench, apparently, forming some kind of attachment to George's grandson. Their eyes met across the morning light. William's face went pale. "Mr. Santos," William said quietly, not a question. "Stay away from my grandson." George's voice shook with protective fury. "I would never hurt him. That's what they all say." William met his gaze steadily, oxygen hissing through the tubes. "You're right to be cautious. You're a good grandfather. Miguel talks about you constantly. Says you're his hero." The compliment felt like manipulation. "I mean it. Stay away." "I will if that's what you want." George turned to leave, then stopped. "Why him? Why my Miguel?" William's face did something complicated. Because he's the only person in months who's asked if I'm okay, and because—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "It doesn't matter. You're right. I'll stay away." George walked away feeling like he'd won a battle, but lost something he couldn't name. At the hospital that afternoon, mopping the same floors he mopped every day, he couldn't stop thinking about the look on that dying man's face, like he was seeing a ghost, like he was seeing everything he'd lost. Miguel's fingers were stained rainbow colors, red, blue, yellow, green, from the used crayons Mrs. Beatrice had given him. She was his favorite teacher, the one who noticed things, noticed when he came to school hungry, noticed when his shoes had holes, noticed when his drawings showed more imagination than the expensive art supplies other kids could ever produce. "This is beautiful, Miguel," she said, holding up his latest picture. Two stick figures on a bench, surrounded by elaborate hearts and birds that looked more like flying potatoes. Who are these people? Miguel hesitated. Vovo had told him to stay away from William, but Vovo also said lying was wrong. And Mrs. Beatrice had kind eyes that reminded him of his mom. "That's me and my friend William. He's teaching me about birds." Mrs. Beatrice's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "A grown-up friend. He's old and sick. He needs somebody to talk to." Miguel lowered his voice conspiratorially. "I think he's very lonely, like those sad people on Vovo's novellas." "Does your grandfather know about this friend?" Miguel concentrated hard on coloring a bird's wing. "Vovo worries too much, but William is nice. He told me about how his mom used to bring him to the park when he was little. She taught him to notice beautiful things." Mrs. Beatrice crouched down to his level, her skirt pooling on the classroom floor. "Miguel, honey, I need you to be very careful. Some adults—" "I know about stranger danger," Miguel interrupted, "but William isn't a stranger anymore. We're friends. Real friends, like how you're always saying friendship is about seeing people's hearts, not their outsides." She couldn't argue with her own lessons. Miguel saw her struggle with it, saw the concern war with her belief in his judgment. Finally, she sighed. "Promise me you'll never go anywhere private with him. Only the park, only where people can see you." "I promise." That afternoon, Miguel snuck back to Riverside Park. William was there. Exactly where he'd been before. Oxygen tank, hissing its mechanical breath. He looked worse than yesterday. Grayer, more fragile, like a paper doll that might blow away. William's face transformed when he spotted Miguel, then collapsed into something sadder. "Miguel, you shouldn't be here." "Why not?" Miguel plopped down on the bench, swinging his legs. "Your grandfather is right. You should stay away from strange men." "But you're not strange." "Well, maybe a little," Miguel grinned. "You talk fancy, like people on TV, and you know lots of big words, but you're not scary." William's laugh turned into a cough that racked his whole body. Miguel waited patiently until it passed. The way Vovo had taught him to wait when old Mrs. Lourdes had her dizzy spells. "I brought you something," Miguel said, pulling out the drawing from his backpack. "Mrs. Beatrice said it was beautiful. See, that's us. And those are the birds you told me about. The red one is cardinal. The grey one is mockingbird. The tiny one is— I forgot. Chickadee." William took the drawing with trembling hands, studied it for a long moment. "This is the kindest gift anyone's given me in years. Really, but it's just crayons." "Exactly." William's eyes were wet. "May I keep it?" "Sure, I can make more. I have lots of ideas. Tomorrow I'll draw the whole park, and the trees, and maybe some squirrels because they're funny when they stuff their faces with nuts." "Miguel." William's voice broke. "Tomorrow might not—" A woman appeared on the path, tall, dark-skinned, wearing nurse's scrubs with cartoon characters on them. Her eyes widened when she saw Miguel. "Mr. Chase, you didn't mention you were expecting company." "Carla, this is Miguel." "Miguel, this is Carla. She takes care of me." Carla's professional smile was tight. "Nice to meet you, sweetie. Mr. Chase, we should get you home. You've been out here for 2 hours. Just a few more minutes. William?" Her voice held gentle firmness. "Your oxygen levels." Miguel jumped up. "I should go anyway. Vovo worries when I'm late." He started backing away, then stopped. "Will you be here tomorrow, William? Really, truly?" William and Carla exchanged a look Miguel couldn't read. "I'll try," William said finally. Miguel ran home, the drawing still bright in his mind. He didn't see the way Carla helped William stand, how his legs nearly gave out, didn't hear her whispered, "Oh, William, who is that child?" Didn't hear William's answer. "My son." At the apartment, Vovo was already home, sitting at the table with bills spread out like cards in a losing hand. He looked up when Miguel entered, and his face did something complicated. "How was school?" "Good." Miguel carefully didn't mention the park. It wasn't lying exactly. School had been good, but that night, as Miguel lay on the pull-out sofa pretending to sleep, he heard Vovo on the phone in the bathroom. The walls were thin enough that every word carried, "Mrs. Lourdes is in the hospital. Pneumonia, they think." "Yes, the same hospital where I work. Thank God for small favors." "No, I can't miss work. We're already behind on rent." "Yes, I know. Vovo's voice cracked on the last words. Miguel squeezed his eyes shut and pretended harder. In the morning, he would bring William an extra special drawing, one with flowers and sunshine and words that said "friends forever," even though he wasn't sure how to spell forever, and would probably need Mrs. Beatrice's help. Friends made things better. Everyone knew that. Even if Vovo said they shouldn't, William Chase stared at the DNA test results for the 1,000th time. The paper worn soft from handling, probability of paternity, 99.9 to 99%. The numbers hadn't changed since the day 8 months ago, when they destroyed and rebuilt his entire world. Richard Morrison sat across from him in the study, lawyer's eyes sharp, despite his rumpled appearance. They'd been friends since law school, which meant Richard was one of 3 people who could tell William he was being an idiot without getting fired. "You're playing with fire," Richard said. "That child is bonding with you. His grandfather is rightfully suspicious, and Marcus is circling like a shark who smells blood. Marcus can go to hell. He's already challenging your competency. Says you're mentally unfit to make financial decisions if he finds out about Miguel. He won't." "William," Richard leaned forward, elbows on knees. "What exactly is your endgame here? You die in—" He checked his watch. "Roughly 48 hours. By my count, that boy loses his mother and then loses you. You think that's kindness?" William set down the test results, hands shaking. The oxygen machine hummed its endless song. His reflection in the window showed a ghost, sunken cheeks, yellowish skin, eyes too large in a skull-like face. Dying looked exactly like it felt. "I won't tell him," William said quietly. "I won't burden him with a father who's already leaving." "Then why the visits?" "Because—" William's voice broke. He took a moment, breathing carefully through the plastic tubes. "Because Sarah asked me to watch over him on her deathbed. And because for 5 minutes every morning, I get to know my son. That's more than I deserve." Richard was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was gentler. "The trust fund is ironclad. Miguel's education, housing, medical care, all covered until he's 25. Even Marcus can't break it. Make it until he's 30. And add a clause. If anything happens to the grandfather, Miguel gets immediate access to emergency funds. That man is working himself to death. Already done." William pulled open his desk drawer and removed a sealed envelope. His handwriting on the front, surprisingly steady, for Miguel Santos to be opened on his 18th birthday. "This explains everything. The truth about Sarah, about me, about why I made the choices I did. You're putting a lot of faith in an 18-year-old's ability to understand. He has her compassion." "He'll understand." Richard took the envelope, tucked it into his briefcase. "Carla called me yesterday, said you collapsed after Miguel left. Said your lips were blue by the time she got you inside. I'm fine. You're dying. William, there's a difference." The silence between them held 40 years of friendship. Richard had been best man at the wedding that never happened. Sarah had called it off 3 days before. Said William loved his company more than her. Said she couldn't compete with ambition. Richard had held William when he drank himself stupid for 6 months afterward. Had tried to convince him to go after her, to fight for what mattered. William hadn't listened. By the time he'd finally worked up the courage to find her, Sarah was already pregnant and proud and refusing his help. "I don't need your guilt money," she'd told him. "I'll manage fine on my own." He'd let her. God help him, he'd let her. "There's something else," Richard said. "Marcus hired an investigator. He's been following you. Let him follow. William, if he connects Miguel to you, if he figures out the paternity, he'll use it. He'll claim undue influence, manipulation, that you were exploited in a vulnerable state. He'll drag that child and his grandfather through court for years." William felt ice in his veins. "Can you stop him? I've got witnesses lined up. Carla will testify to your mental clarity. I've got your medical record showing you've been competent throughout. But the best defense is for Miguel to stay invisible, just another kind kid who visited a dying stranger. He's not just—" William couldn't finish the sentence. Richard's face softened. "I know, but that's the only way to protect him." That night, William couldn't sleep. The morphine turned his thoughts syrupy and strange. He kept seeing Sarah's face the last time he'd seen her alive, in the hospital. After the accident, her body broken but her eyes fierce. "Promise me," she'd gasped, holding his hand with surprising strength. "Promise you'll watch over him. He's yours, William. I did the test. Kept it secret, thought you should know before I—" "Don't," William had begged. "Don't leave, please. I'll do better. I'll be better. We can—" "Too late for us, not too late for him. Promise. I promise." She died an hour later. William had walked out of the hospital into the rain and thrown up in a parking lot. Then he'd gone home and started rewriting his will. Now, Miguel appeared at the park every morning like clockwork. Brought drawings, stories, questions about birds and trees, and whether William had ever been to the ocean. Never asked for anything. Never seemed to notice the Rolex watch or the expensive shoes or any marker of the wealth that separated their worlds. Just sat beside a dying man and shared cookies that probably cost 30 cents. On the fourth morning, William asked, "Miguel, why do you come here? You could be playing with your friends." The boy considered this seriously. Legs swinging from the bench. "Vovo is always tired, Mrs. Lourdes is sick. My friends at school have their own families. But you—" He paused, choosing words carefully. "You look like you need somebody to remember you're here." "I'm nobody special." "That's not true." "You're my friend. That makes you special." William's chest constricted, oxygen suddenly insufficient. He pulled a stone from his pocket. Smooth, grey, ordinary. "I found this by the pond. I want you to have it." Miguel turned it over in his small hands. "It's beautiful. It's just a rock." "No," Miguel held it up to the morning light. "See, it has sparkles, like stars got stuck inside. I'll keep it forever." He wouldn't, of course. He'd lose it like children lose things. But William hoped maybe he'd keep it long enough to remember there'd been someone who'd loved him before he knew what love cost. The fifth morning arrived cold and clear. Miguel came running up the path, backpack bouncing, completely alive. William felt his heart stutter, skip, strain against the inevitable. "I learned something new," Miguel burst out. "Did you know some birds fly thousands of miles just to be where they're supposed to be? Mrs. Beatrice told us about migration. Isn't that amazing?" "Amazing," William agreed, though he could barely focus through the pain building in his chest. Miguel climbed up beside him, chattering about cardinals and their songs. William let the words wash over him, holding on to consciousness through sheer will. He wanted these last minutes, deserved them or not. He wanted them. "Miguel," he managed, "you're a remarkable person. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise," the boy beamed. "You too, William." William felt something break inside him, not his heart, though that was going too, but something deeper, the last wall between who he'd been and who he should have been. He reached out and took Miguel's small hand in his, feeling the warmth of it, the pulse of life. "Thank you," William whispered, "for seeing me." Miguel squeezed his hand. "That's what friends do." The world went soft around the edges. William heard Carla's voice from somewhere far away, felt hands pulling at him. Miguel's face swam in his vision, concerned and beautiful and heartbreakingly alive. "I have to go now," William said. Or thought he said, "But I'll always be watching, always." The last thing he saw was Miguel's drawing clutched in his other hand, two stick figures on a bench, surrounded by elaborate hearts. The last thing he felt was peace. Carla caught William before he hit the ground. Miguel jumped back, eyes wide with fear, as the nurse lowered the unconscious man carefully onto the bench. Her fingers found his pulse, thready, irregular, but still there. "Miguel, honey, I need you to run and get help. See that lady jogging? Tell her to call 911. But Miguel was frozen, staring at William's grey face. "Is he dying?" "He's—" Carla swallowed the truth, offered comfort instead. "He needs a doctor. Can you be brave and get help?" Miguel ran. Carla focused on keeping William stable, monitoring his breathing, watching the oxygen levels on the tank. She'd been a nurse for 20 years, knew death when she saw it approaching. The ambulance came fast. Paramedics loaded William onto a gurney while Miguel watched from behind the jogging woman, who kept one protective hand on his shoulder. As they wheeled William away, he opened his eyes briefly, sought out Miguel's face. "Sorry," he whispered, "didn't mean to scare you." Then he was gone, ambulance wailing into the morning. Miguel walked to school in a daze. Mrs. Beatrice noticed immediately, of course she did, and sent him to the guidance counselor when he couldn't focus on his math worksheet. The counselor, Mr. Davis, asked careful questions that Miguel answered automatically. Yes, he was okay. No, he hadn't been hurt. Yes, he'd tell his grandfather, but in his pocket Miguel's fingers found the smooth stone William had given him, and he held it so tight it hurt at the hospital across town. Carla stood outside William's private room and made the hardest phone call of her career. Richard Morrison answered on the first ring. "He's alive," she said. "Barely, maybe 24 hours. He wants to see you." Richard arrived within the hour. William was conscious but weak, the oxygen mask covering his face making speech difficult. Richard pulled it down gently. "Don't talk, just listen." Richard pulled out his briefcase, began spreading documents across the rolling table. "Everything is ready, the trust fund, the property deed, the education provisions. All you need to do is sign." William's hand shook so badly he could barely hold the pen. Richard guided it, signature by signature. Watching his oldest friend perform his final act of fatherhood, Marcus called. Richard said quietly, "His investigator followed Miguel home yesterday. He knows about the visits, knows there's some connection. He's going to use it against the will." William's eyes closed in pain, not physical, something worse. "I've got a plan," Richard continued. "But William, you need to tell me the truth. Is George Santos aware that you're Miguel's biological father?" A barely perceptible shake of the head. "Does anyone know besides you, me, and the late Sarah Santos?" Another shake. "Then we keep it that way for now. It's the only way to protect Miguel from Marcus's challenges. After you're gone, after everything settles, I'll present the evidence. But if Marcus smells blood before the will is executed, he'll tie everything up in litigation for years. That boy and his grandfather won't see a penny." William's lips moved behind the oxygen mask. Richard leaned close. "Tell him I was honored to be his friend." Richard's eyes stung. "You're a better man than you think you are." "No, but maybe, in the end, I did one thing right." William died at 3:47 a.m. the following morning. Alone, because he'd sent Carla home to sleep, because he'd always faced endings alone, because some habits were too deeply carved to change, even at the last. The funeral was small. Richard, Carla, a handful of business associates who came out of obligation. Marcus Webb stood in the back, arms crossed, face calculating he didn't grieve. He planned. George Santos read about William Chase's death in the newspaper's business section 3 days later, felt an unexpected twist of sadness for the dying man who'd sat with his grandson. Then he turned the page and forgot about it, because Mrs. Lourdes was being discharged from the hospital and someone needed to help her up the stairs. Miguel drew a picture that day, a stick figure with angel wings. Sitting on a cloud shaped like a park bench, Mrs. Beatrice found him crying over it during art class. "He was old," Miguel said, tears dripping onto the paper, "and sick, but I thought maybe, if I was nice enough, he'd get better." Mrs. Beatrice held him while he sobbed. Sometimes love isn't about fixing people, honey. Sometimes it's just about being there while they go. Miguel kept the stone in his pocket, touched it during reading time, during lunch, during the long walk home through the park. The bench was empty now, would always be empty. Miguel sat on it anyway, because maybe William's spirit would know he'd come back, would know he hadn't forgotten. A week after the funeral, Richard Morrison stood outside a shabby apartment building in the poorest part of town, briefcase in hand, heart hammering. This was it, the moment that would change everything or destroy it all. He climbed the stairs to the second floor and knocked on apartment 2B. George Santos opened the door, recognition flickering across his weathered face. "I know you. You were at the hospital sometimes. Sarah's last days." "Yes, my name is Richard Morrison. I'm an attorney. May I come in?" George's face closed down. "If this is about debt collectors—" "It's not. It's about William Chase and your grandson." "Please, Mr. Santos, 5 minutes of your time could change Miguel's life." George stared at him for a long moment, then stepped aside. 5 minutes. Richard entered the cramped apartment, saw the sofa where Miguel slept. The drawings taped to every available surface, the evidence of love surviving poverty. He set his briefcase on the small table and pulled out documents. William Chase left a substantial trust fund for Miguel, $5 million to be used for education, housing, and medical care. Additionally, all of your current debts have been paid in full, and a 2-bedroom apartment has been purchased for you and Miguel. 20 years of housing. Completely paid. George stared at him. "That's not possible. It's already done. The money is in escrow. The apartment deed is here." Richard pushed papers forward. "Mr. Santos, William Chase was not just a kind stranger who met Miguel in the park. He was—" "No!" George's voice was hard. "This is a scam. You want me to sign something that puts us deeper in debt. Get out. Mr. Santos—" "I said get out." Richard held up both hands, placating. "I understand your skepticism. Take these documents. Have them reviewed by any attorney you choose. I'll pay their fee, verify everything I've told you. But Mr. Santos, this is real. William Chase wanted to give your grandson a future. Please don't let pride prevent Miguel from receiving what's rightfully his." He left the papers on the table and walked out, leaving George standing in the middle of his shabby apartment, staring at documents that promised impossible things. That night, George couldn't sleep, read through the papers a dozen times, looking for the trap, found nothing but legal jargon that promised everything Richard had said. Beside him on the sofa, Miguel slept with the smooth stone clutched in one small fist. Dreaming of angels on park benches and friends who kept their promises, even after they were gone, George Santos sat across from Anna Silva, a legal aid attorney whose office was barely larger than his apartment's bathroom. She'd spent 3 hours reviewing Richard Morrison's documents, her expression growing more astonished with each page. "Mr. Santos," she said finally, "this is legitimate. I've verified the trust fund with the bank. The apartment deed is recorded with the city. Your debts, all $47,000 of them, were paid off 4 days ago. This is real." George's hands shook. "Why? Why would a millionaire leave money to my grandson?" "They met 5 times in a park." Anna hesitated, then pulled out another document Richard had left. "There's something else you need to see. William Chase was Miguel's biological father." The world tilted. George grabbed the desk edge, knuckles white. "That's impossible. Sarah never. She kept it secret. There's a DNA test here, conducted while she was still alive. She apparently reached out to William after her accident and told him the truth before she died. Asked him to watch over Miguel." George remembered Sarah's final days, the private conversations she'd had with visitors while he sat in the hospital cafeteria, too numb with grief to question. The way she'd made him promise to tell Miguel. His father had been a good man who'd loved them both. He'd thought she'd meant Miguel's father had died years ago, like Sarah always claimed. Another lie by omission. "Mr. Santos," Anna's voice was gentle, "are you all right?" "No," George's voice broke. "My daughter lied to me for 8 years. A stranger was my grandson's father, and now everyone will think—" He couldn't finish the thought. Everyone would think Sarah had trapped a rich man. Everyone would think George had known, had schemed. Or, Anna said quietly, everyone will think a dying man tried to do right by a son he never knew. "Mr. Santos, you can refuse this money. It's within your legal rights. But ask yourself, would you be refusing for Miguel's sake or for your pride?" George thought of Miguel's worn shoes, the sofa bed. The nights George worked 3 jobs while his grandson raised himself, the future closing in like a trap, poverty becoming destiny. What do I need to sign? The apartment was in a better neighborhood, not rich, but safe. 2 bedrooms, actual bedrooms, with doors that closed, a kitchen with a full-sized refrigerator, windows that didn't rattle in the wind. Miguel walked through it in silence, touching walls like he expected them to disappear. "This is ours," he whispered. "Really, truly ours. Really, truly." George's throat was tight. "You'll have your own room, mijo, your own bed." Miguel turned to him, eyes wide. "Did you win the lottery?" "Vovo, how did you explain to a 7-year-old that the lottery was a dying father's guilt?" "No, Miguel, your friend William. He left you something. He wanted to make sure you'd be okay." "William did this." Miguel's face crumpled. "But I didn't even get to say goodbye." George held his grandson while he cried and thought about pride and love and the complicated mess of doing right by people you'd wronged. William Chase had abandoned Sarah while she was pregnant, chosen ambition over family, let his son grow up in poverty. But in the end, he tried to make it right. It wasn't enough, could never be enough, but it was something. The knock on their new apartment door came 2 weeks later. George opened it to find Richard Morrison with his briefcase and a thin man in an expensive suit who radiated hostility. "Mr. Santos," Richard said, "this is Marcus Webb. He was William Chase's business partner. He's contesting the will." Marcus stepped forward, uninvited. "Mr. Santos, I'll be direct. My legal team has evidence that William Chase was not in his right mind when he changed his will. He was heavily medicated, emotionally compromised, and clearly manipulated by your—" He glanced at Miguel, who'd appeared in the doorway of his new bedroom. "By your grandson. Manipulated." George's voice was dangerously quiet. "My grandson is 7 years old." "Exactly. Children can be very persuasive, and William Chase was a dying man, desperate for redemption, vulnerable to anyone showing him kindness. I'm prepared to offer you $100,000 to settle this quietly. Take the money, sign a release, and we all move on." George looked at Richard, who gave a barely perceptible shake of his head, looked at Miguel, who was clutching the smooth stone William had given him, looked at Marcus Webb and saw exactly what he was, a man who thought money could erase love. "Get out of my home." Marcus's smile was sharp. "I'll see you in court, Mr. Santos, and when I'm done, you'll be paying legal fees that will make your previous poverty look like luxury." After they left, George sat on the new sofa, still wrapped in plastic because he couldn't quite believe it was theirs to use, and put his head in his hands. Richard had warned him this would happen, had explained that Marcus contested every dollar William left to anyone except the company. "We have to give it back," George said to the empty room. "We can't afford lawyers. You can't fight someone with that kind of money." But Miguel came and sat beside him, pressed the smooth stone into George's palm. "William said it was magic, said it would protect what matters most. We can't give up. Vovo, William wanted me to be okay. We have to fight for him." From the mouth of a child, George closed his fingers around the stone and made a decision that terrified him. "Okay, mijo, we fight." The lawsuit hit 3 days later. Marcus Webb v. the estate of William Chase. The local news picked it up. Rich man's will contested, poor family accused of exploitation. Reporters showed up at Miguel's school, at George's hospital job. Neighbors started looking at them differently, whispers following them through the hallways. "Gold diggers," someone muttered at the supermarket. "That poor man was sick, and they took advantage." Someone else said. George kept his head down, kept working, kept protecting Miguel from the worst of it, but at night, lying in his new bedroom that still felt like someone else's dream, he wondered if they'd made a terrible mistake. In his own room, Miguel whispered to the stone, "Please be magic. Please help William's wish come true." The stone, of course, said nothing. But the next morning, Richard Morrison called with news that would change everything. "We have a witness, Carla Martinez, William's nurse. She's willing to testify that William was completely lucid, that he spoke clearly about his intentions, that he understood exactly what he was doing. And there's more, Mr. Santos, much more." "What?" "William left a letter for Miguel to be opened on his 18th birthday, but the judge has agreed to allow portions of it to be entered into evidence. To prove William's state of mind and his relationship to Miguel, Mr. Santos, this letter changes everything." George felt ice in his stomach. "What does it say?" "It says that William Chase was trying to be the father he never got to be, and that protecting Miguel's future was the only redemption he could ask for. The courtroom battle was about to begin, and somewhere in heaven or nowhere at all, William Chase was finally, belatedly, fighting for his son. The courthouse was intimidating, all marble and echoes and people in expensive suits speaking a language George couldn't follow. He sat beside Richard in the defendant's section, hands clasped to stop their shaking, while Miguel waited outside with Mrs. Beatrice, who'd volunteered to keep him occupied. Marcus Webb's attorney was a woman named Diane Mercer, sharp-featured and sharper-voiced. She stood to deliver opening arguments, and George felt his stomach drop. "Your Honor, this case is about exploitation of a vulnerable man in his final days. William Chase, dying and medicated, formed an inappropriate attachment to a child he barely knew. The boy's family, seeing an opportunity, encouraged this relationship. They never disclosed their connection until after Mr. Chase's death, when suddenly millions of dollars materialized. This is textbook undue influence." Richard stood, calmer than George felt. "Your Honor, this case is about a father trying to care for his son. William Chase wasn't exploited. He was finally, belatedly doing what he should have done years ago. The evidence will show that every decision he made was clear-minded, legally sound and motivated purely by love." The judge, an older black woman named Justice Freeman, looked between them. "I've reviewed the preliminary documents, Mr. Morrison. You claim William Chase was Miguel Santos's biological father." "Yes. Your Honor, we have DNA evidence conducted by an independent laboratory while Sarah Santos was still alive. We also have testimony from William's nurse, documentation from his attorneys, and most significantly, a letter William wrote explaining his decisions." "Your Honor," Diane Mercer interrupted, "the alleged DNA test was conducted secretly without proper chain of custody, and this letter was conveniently written days before Mr. Chase's death, when he was heavily sedated. I was there." Carla Martinez stood from the gallery, voice ringing. "I administered his medications. William Chase was lucid every single day until his last. He knew exactly what he was doing." Justice Freeman banged her gavel. "Miss Martinez, you'll have your turn to testify. Please sit down." But her eyes held approval. The trial unfolded over 3 days. Marcus's side presented a parade of witnesses. Business associates who claimed William had been confused in his final months, a doctor who cited the effects of pain medication on decision-making, financial experts who called the trust fund excessive and suspicious, but they couldn't explain away the documentation, couldn't explain why William had worked with 3 different attorneys to ensure the will was ironclad, couldn't explain the DNA test that Sarah herself had requested or her deathbed confession to William. Richard called Carla to the stand. She sat straight-backed, nurse's scrubs replaced by a simple dress, and told the truth. "William Chase was the clearest-minded dying patient I've ever cared for," she said. "He knew his time was limited. He spent every conscious moment trying to set things right when he told me Miguel was his son. I didn't believe him at first, but the way he looked at that child," her voice caught, "that wasn't manipulation, that was love. Did Miguel or George Santos ever ask William for money? Richard asked. Never. Miguel just wanted someone to talk to. He brought drawings, shared cookies, made William laugh for the first time in months. That boy gave more than he ever took, Diane Mercer cross-examined. But Carla didn't budge. Yes, William had been on pain medication. No, it didn't affect his mental clarity. Yes, the relationship was brief. No, that didn't make William's decisions invalid, Mrs. Beatrice testified about Miguel's character. His kindness, his innocence, his complete lack of guile. That child doesn't have a manipulative bone in his body, she said firmly. He befriended William because he saw someone who needed a friend. Period. The breakthrough came on day 3, when Richard presented the sealed letter. Justice Freeman had agreed to allow portions to be read into evidence, though the full letter would remain sealed until Miguel's 18th birthday. Richard stood before the court, envelope in hand. This is William Chase's final testimony, his explanation, in his own words, of his decisions and his relationship to Miguel Santos. He broke the seal carefully, removed several pages of handwritten text. George saw Marcus Webb lean forward, face tight with calculation. Richard read, "To my son Miguel, by the time you read this, you'll be 18 years old. A man. I won't be there to see it, and that's my greatest regret. I want you to understand why I made the choices I did, both the terrible ones and the ones I hope were right." The courtroom was silent, except for Richard's voice. Steady and clear. "Your mother Sarah and I loved each other once, loved each other badly, the way young people do when they think passion is enough. When she got pregnant, I wasn't ready, wasn't brave enough. I chose my career over my family, and she was too proud to force my hand. That decision haunted me every day for 8 years." George felt tears on his face. Beside him, the empty chair where Miguel should sit felt heavier than presence. Richard continued, "When Sarah lay dying, she told me the truth, told me you were mine. I had the test done to be certain, not because I doubted her, but because I needed proof for this moment. When lawyers would question my motives and claim I was being manipulated, Miguel, you weren't manipulating me. You were saving me. Every morning you showed up at that park. You gave me something I didn't deserve, a chance to be your father, even if you never knew it." Someone in the gallery sobbed quietly. Justice Freeman's face remained impassive, but her eyes were bright. "The money isn't guilt money or charity. It's what a father owes his son. Security, opportunity, a future that isn't limited by poverty I could have prevented. George Santos raised you when I failed to. He's your real father in every way that matters. This trust fund is meant to support him as he supported you, to give you both the breathing room to build a life worthy of the people you are." Richard paused, looked at Marcus Webb. The letter goes on to address potential challenges to his will. I'll read the relevant section. "I know Marcus will contest this. He's a businessman who sees every dollar as rightfully his. But this money isn't business. It's my last act of fatherhood. I've had 3 separate attorneys review my decisions. I've undergone psychiatric evaluation. I've documented every step precisely so no one can claim I wasn't in my right mind. Miguel, if you're reading this, it means I succeeded. It means you're safe. That's all I ever wanted." The courtroom erupted. Diane Mercer was on her feet, objecting. Marcus Webb's face had gone purple. Justice Freeman banged her gavel repeatedly. "Order, I will have order." When silence finally returned, Justice Freeman looked at the attorneys. "Do either of you have anything to add?" Richard shook his head. "The letter speaks for itself, Your Honor." Diane Mercer opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Your Honor, we maintain that." But she had nothing. The letter had destroyed every argument. Justice Freeman took off her glasses, cleaned them slowly. "I'll deliver my ruling tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Court is adjourned." That night, George couldn't sleep. Miguel curled up beside him in the new bed. Still not used to the space, the quiet, the possibility of safety. Did we win, Vovo? I don't know, mijo. I hope so. William's letter was nice. He sounds like he was sad. Very sad. But he tried to fix it. That counts for something, right? George kissed his grandson's forehead. Yes, Mijo, that counts for everything. Justice Freeman entered the courtroom at precisely 10 a.m. Face unreadable, George stood, legs shaking, holding Miguel's hand so tight the boy squeaked. Richard had insisted Miguel be present for the verdict. He deserves to hear his father's will be honored, he'd said. Marcus Webb sat across the aisle. Flanked by 3 attorneys now instead of 1, he'd hired reinforcements after the letter, sensing defeat but unwilling to surrender. Diane Mercer looked tired, like she'd spent the night arguing with a client who wouldn't listen to reason. Please be seated, Justice Freeman said. The rustle of people sitting felt deafening. I've spent considerable time reviewing this case, she began. The evidence, the testimonies, most significantly, the letter from William Chase. This court must determine whether William Chase was mentally competent when he established the trust fund, and whether undue influence was exerted by the Santos family. George held his breath. The evidence is clear. William Chase underwent psychiatric evaluation 1 week before his death. Dr. Patricia Chen, a court-certified psychiatrist, found him to be of sound mind. His attorneys, 3 separate firms, all testified to his lucidity and clear intentions. His nurse documented his mental clarity. The letter itself demonstrates sophisticated reasoning and awareness of legal challenges. Justice Freeman looked directly at Marcus Webb. Mr. Webb, your claim of undue influence rests on the premise that a 7-year-old child manipulated a dying CEO. The evidence shows the opposite. Miguel Santos demonstrated simple human kindness to a stranger. He had no knowledge of William Chase's wealth. He asked for nothing. He gave companionship to a dying man. That is not manipulation. That is compassion. Marcus's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Furthermore, Justice Freeman continued, the DNA evidence conclusively proves William Chase was Miguel Santos's biological father. While he chose not to reveal this relationship to the child, a choice this court has no business judging, he did exercise his parental right and obligation to provide for his son. The trust fund is not excessive. It's responsible fatherhood, albeit tragically late. She picked up her gavel. The will of William Chase stands as written. The trust fund is legitimate. The property transfer is valid. Marcus Webb's challenge is denied. Furthermore, Mr. Webb, your investigator's actions in photographing a minor child without parental consent and your attempts to intimidate witnesses constitute harassment. Consider this a warning. The gavel fell. Final, irreversible. George couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process that it was over, that they'd won, that Miguel's future was secure. Miguel looked up at him. Vovo, are you okay? George pulled his grandson into his arms and wept. Across the aisle, Marcus Webb stood abruptly, face contorted with rage. This is a travesty. That money belongs to the company. Mr. Webb, Justice Freeman's voice could have frozen lava. You're dangerously close to contempt of court. I suggest you leave before I change my mind about the warning. Marcus turned on his heel and stalked out, his attorneys scrambling to follow. Diane Mercer approached Richard with her hand extended. Congratulations, counselor, for what it's worth. I think the judge got it right. Richard shook her hand. Thank you for keeping it professional. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Richard held up a hand. One statement only, William Chase was a good man who made mistakes. He spent his final days trying to correct them. His son, Miguel, is a remarkable child who deserves privacy and peace. The trust fund is not news. It's a father taking care of his family. That's all. They pushed through the crowd to Richard's car. Inside, away from the cameras, George finally let himself fall apart. Richard drove them home while George sobbed into his hands, years of fear and struggle and barely contained desperation pouring out. Miguel patted his grandfather's shoulder, small hand steady. It's okay, Vovo. William's helping us, just like he promised. That evening, Mrs. Lourdes came to visit, out of the hospital finally. Walking with a cane but alive, she'd heard about the verdict on the news, had dragged herself over, despite Carla's protests that she should rest. Meu filho, she said to George, pulling him into a hug that smelled like lavender and old lady perfume. God is good. William Chase is watching over you from heaven, making sure you're okay. Miguel showed her his new room, the drawings he'd hung on the walls, the smooth stone on his nightstand. This was William's. He said it was magic. Maybe it is. Mrs. Lourdes picked up the stone, turned it in the light. Magic is just love with a different name, Menino. Your friend loved you very much. I wish I could tell him thank you. He knows, Mrs. Lourdes said, kissing the top of Miguel's head. Trust an old woman, he knows. Late that night, after everyone had gone home and Miguel was asleep, George stood in the doorway of his grandson's room. Watch the boy sleep in his new bed, safe and warm and secure. No more sofa beds, no more wondering how to pay the electric bill, no more choosing between medicine and food. William Chase had given them that. A stranger who turned out to be family, a father who'd failed spectacularly but tried to succeed posthumously. George thought about forgiveness, about how complicated love could be, about how maybe people deserved credit for doing right eventually, even if eventually was almost too late. Thank you, he whispered to the darkness, for loving him, for trying, for seeing what I couldn't, that my pride matters less than his future. Somewhere, maybe William heard. Maybe he didn't, but George said it anyway, because some things needed saying even if no one was listening. In his room, Miguel dreamed of park benches and red birds and a man with kind eyes who told him everyone deserved to be seen. In his sleep he smiled, holding the magic stone close, and in the morning life began again, new, strange, full of possibility. 5 years passed like water through fingers, fast and slow simultaneously. The way childhood moves. Miguel was 12 now, taller but still carrying the same gentle soul. The trust fund paid for a good school, the kind with art programs and field trips and teachers who cared. He excelled at everything, not because he was brilliant, but because he tried hard and people wanted to help him succeed. George had quit all 3 jobs, worked part-time at the hospital now, not for money, but because he liked the routine, liked feeling useful. He'd enrolled in community college, taking classes in social work, thinking maybe he could help other families struggling the way they'd struggled. The apartment became home. They hung pictures, painted walls, planted tomatoes in pots on the small balcony. Miguel's room filled with books and art supplies and the slow accumulation of a childhood that wasn't defined by scarcity. But the smooth stone stayed on his nightstand, untouched except when he needed courage. Mrs. Beatrice retired that year, and Miguel cried at her farewell party. She'd been his champion, the one who'd seen potential when he'd arrived in worn clothes and broken shoes. She hugged him tight and whispered, "You're going to do great things, Miguel. I know it in my bones." Carla Martinez became a regular presence in their lives. She'd visit for coffee, tell stories about William that made him human. His terrible jokes, his love of old movies, his habit of leaving notes to himself everywhere. She never let them forget that William had been more than a checkbook. He'd been a person, flawed and trying. "He would be so proud of you," she told Miguel on his 12th birthday. "You've become exactly the person he hoped you'd be." Mrs. Lourdes died peacefully in her sleep at 79. Miguel and George attended her funeral. Miguel placing a drawing in her casket, just like he'd done with William. 2 stick figures in a garden surrounded by flowers. "So she's not alone," he explained. Death was becoming familiar, not frightening anymore, just sad, just part of the cycle. At 15, Miguel started a volunteer program at the hospital where George worked. He'd visit patients who had no family, sit with them, draw pictures, ask about their lives. The nurses called him "our little angel." George called him what William would have been if he'd been brave enough. Marcus Webb disappeared from their lives entirely. Richard heard through legal circles that he'd had a breakdown, sold his stake in Chase Industries, moved to Montana or Maine or somewhere else that started with M. Some people said he'd found religion. Others said he'd lost his mind. George didn't care which. The man had tried to steal Miguel's future and failed. That was enough. On Miguel's 16th birthday, Richard Morrison took him to lunch. They'd developed an unlikely friendship over the years. The elderly lawyer and the teenager who reminded him why he'd gone into law in the first place. "I have something for you," Richard said over burgers. "Not the letter. That's still sealed until you're 18. But William left instructions for me to give you this on your 16th birthday." He handed Miguel an envelope. Inside was a photograph. William and Sarah, young and in love, sitting on a park bench. Sarah was laughing, William looking at her like she'd hung the moon. On the back, in William's handwriting, "Before we complicated everything, before I forgot what mattered. This is who your mother was, full of light, and who I should have been." Miguel stared at the photo for a long time. Finally he said, "They look happy." They were for a while. Do you think he regretted it? Letting her go, Richard considered, every single day. But regret isn't useless, Miguel. William turned his into action. He couldn't fix the past, but he tried to fix your future. That's what separated him from people who just stay bitter. Miguel tucked the photo carefully back into the envelope. "I'm going to Harvard, did Vovo tell you? He mentioned full scholarship. William would have been," Richard's voice caught, "he would have been so proud. I want to study social work, help people like Vovo and me, people who need someone to see them." Richard smiled. "Like your mother, she was a nurse because she wanted to help people too. And like William, eventually you got the best of both of them." At 17, Miguel won a national essay contest. The prompt was "Someone who changed your life." He wrote about William, about 5 mornings in a park, about learning that kindness didn't require knowing someone's story, just seeing their humanity. The essay went viral. Media outlets picked it up. Reporters came calling again. But this time the story was different. Not poor family exploits dying millionaire, but small acts of kindness ripple across years. Miguel appeared on a morning talk show. The host, a woman with kind eyes, asked, "Do you ever wish you'd known William was your father?" Miguel thought about it. "Sometimes, but I think he made the right choice. He didn't want to become someone I'd grieve for. He wanted to become someone who helped me, and he did. What's the most important thing he taught you? That everyone deserves to be seen, even people who seem fine, even people who seem like they have everything. Sometimes especially them, because they're the ones nobody thinks to ask, 'Are you okay?'" George watched from the green room, wiping his eyes. His grandson was going to be fine, more than fine. Miguel was going to spend his life making sure other people didn't fall through the cracks the way they almost had. On the morning of Miguel's 18th birthday, Richard Morrison arrived at their apartment with the sealed letter. George, Miguel, and Carla sat together at the kitchen table. Richard placed the envelope in front of Miguel. "This is yours now. Whatever it says is between you and William. But I want you to know, he wrote it over 3 days. While he was lucid and clear, it's his heart, Miguel, his complete truth." Miguel's hands shook as he broke the seal. Inside were 15 pages of handwritten text. William's handwriting, careful and precise even as death approached. He read silently, tears streaming down his face. George wanted to reach for him but held back. This was Miguel's moment with his father. Finally, Miguel looked up. He tells the whole story. Meeting Mum, falling in love, being too scared to choose family over success, how he tried to find her after I was born, but she refused to see him, how he felt when she told him the truth in the hospital, how those 5 mornings with me were the best moments of his entire life. Carla was crying openly now. "What else does he say?" Miguel wiped his eyes, smiled through tears. "He says he's sorry he wasn't brave enough to be my father while he lived, but he hopes maybe, someday, when I've lived enough to understand how people fail and try again, I'll forgive him, and he says—" Miguel's voice broke. "He says I already gave him more than he deserved, 5 mornings of being seen." George finally reached across the table, took his grandson's hand. "Do you forgive him?" "Yeah, Vovo, I do." That fall, Miguel Santos Chase, he'd added William's name at 16, started at Harvard. His roommate was a kid from Seattle who played guitar badly and made terrible jokes. His classes were hard but exhilarating. His future was uncertain but possible. And in his dorm room, On the desk beside his laptop sat a smooth grey stone that held stars inside. Miguel Santos Chase graduated summa cum laude from Harvard at 22 with a master's in social work. George sat in the audience, 70 years old and proud beyond measure, watching his grandson cross the stage in a cap and gown. Beside him, Carla Martinez dabbed her eyes with a tissue. Richard Morrison, now retired, beamed like Miguel was his own grandson. The thesis Miguel had written became the foundation for his life's work. The Invisible Ones, Creating Connection in an Age of Isolation. It explored how modern society ignored the elderly, the homeless, the marginalized, made them invisible through indifference rather than malice. 6 months after graduation, Miguel launched the Me Vê program. The name meant "see me" in Portuguese, a tribute to his mother's heritage and William's final gift. The concept was simple. Train volunteers to seek out isolated elderly people in parks, nursing homes, bus stops, anywhere loneliness gathered. Sit with them, listen, draw pictures if they wanted. Just be present. The first pilot program ran in Boston with 12 volunteers and 23 elderly participants. The results were immediate. Participants reported decreased depression, increased sense of purpose, better physical health. The volunteers reported learning patience, wisdom, gaining perspective. Media coverage exploded again. The boy who'd befriended a dying millionaire was now creating systematic kindness. Donors appeared, foundations offered grants. Within 2 years, Me Vê operated in 40 states, matching thousands of volunteers with thousands of isolated seniors. Miguel hired Carla as clinical director. Her nursing background and intimate understanding of end-of-life care made her perfect. They developed training protocols, safety guidelines, evaluation metrics, but at the heart of the program remained the simple act Miguel had performed at 7 years old. Asking, "Are you okay?" George became the program's oldest volunteer. 3 times a week, he visited an elder care facility, sat with residents who had no family, shared stories about his own life. The residents loved him. The staff loved him. Miguel loved watching his grandfather finally rest into a life that wasn't about survival. At 25, Miguel published a book, 5 Mornings, How Brief Connections Transform Lives. It became a bestseller, not because it was brilliantly written, but because it was painfully honest. Miguel didn't sugarcoat William's failures, or Sarah's struggles, or George's exhaustion. He didn't pretend poverty was noble, or that money didn't matter. But he also didn't let anyone reduce William to just a checkbook, or Sarah to just a victim, or George to just a struggling guardian. They were people, complicated and trying. The book honored that complexity. The book tour took Miguel across the country. At every reading, people lined up to share their own stories of brief connections that changed everything. A teacher who believed in them, a stranger who helped in a crisis, a parent who tried despite failing. The world was full of Williams and Sarahs and Georges, people doing their imperfect best. Miguel met Elena at a reading in Chicago. She was a pediatric oncologist, there because her hospital was considering implementing a Me Vê program for their young patients. They talked for 3 hours after the event, finding common ground in their shared belief that presence mattered more than solutions. They married 2 years later. George walked Miguel down the aisle, 82 years old and needing a cane. But standing straight with pride, Carla and Richard sat in the front row. Mrs. Beatrice sent flowers from her retirement home in Florida. The ceremony was small, focused on what mattered. 2 people promising to see each other, truly see each other, every day. Miguel and Elena had 3 children over the next 8 years. They named the first George, after the man who'd raised Miguel, the second Sarah, after the mother who'd loved fiercely despite everything, and the third William, after the father who'd tried to do right when it was almost too late. The trust fund, invested wisely, kept growing. Miguel used portions of it to fund Me Vé's expansion, to create scholarships for social work students, to pay off medical debts for families drowning in bills. He never forgot where he came from, never pretended money didn't matter, never stopped understanding that sometimes love required resources. George lived to 92, healthy and whole almost to the end. In his final days, Miguel sat by his bedside in the apartment they'd shared for so many years. George's breathing was labored, his body failing, but his mind remained sharp. "I'm proud of you, mijo," George whispered. "So proud. You took what William gave you and made it mean something. You taught me how," Miguel said. "You taught me that love is showing up, working 3 jobs, sharing the last cookie, protecting people when they can't protect themselves. Your mother would be proud too. I know." Vovo, I know. George's funeral filled the church. Volunteers from Mive came from across the country, residents from the elder care facility, nurses from the hospital where George had worked, the priest who'd baptized Miguel. Richard Morrison, frail now but determined to attend. Carla Martinez, reading a eulogy about a man who taught her that heroism looked like persistence. Miguel spoke last, stood at the podium with the same smooth stone in his pocket that William had given him 25 years earlier. He talked about his grandfather's calloused hands and tired eyes and endless capacity to keep going, about how George had been a father when he didn't have to be, had chosen Miguel every single day. And then, as his final act, Miguel placed a drawing in the casket, the same drawing he'd made for William all those years ago. 2 stick figures on a park bench, holding hands, surrounded by elaborate hearts. "So he's not alone," Miguel told his children later, the same words he'd said about Mrs. Lourdes, about William, about everyone he'd loved and lost. "So he knows we remember," on a Sunday afternoon. Miguel took his 3 children to Riverside Park. They walked the familiar paths, past the pond and the oak trees, to the bench where everything had started. The city had installed a plaque 5 years earlier. Bronze and understated, William Chase and Miguel Santos, where kindness began, everyone deserves to be seen. Miguel's children climbed on the bench, arguing about who got to sit in the middle. His son George asked, "Dad, is this where you met great-grandpa William?" "This is where I met a friend who changed everything," Miguel corrected gently, "and where I learned the most important lesson of my life, that the smallest acts of kindness create the biggest ripples." His daughter Sarah pointed. "Look, Dad, there's a red bird like in your story." A cardinal perched on the bench's backrest, tilting its head, it sang 3 clear notes, the same pattern William had pointed out 25 years earlier, then flew toward the morning sun. Elena stood beside Miguel, their youngest. William, balanced on her hip. "You're thinking about him," she said. "Always. Every single day. I wonder if he knew what he started, if he understood that those 5 mornings would become 40 states and thousands of lives and—" Miguel gestured at his children. "His family, his future, all of this. He knew. That's why he wrote the letter, why he set up the trust. He was planting a tree whose shade he'd never sit in." Miguel kissed her temple. "We teach our kids to plant trees," as they prepared to leave. An elderly man shuffled down the path. He moved slowly, using a walker, breathing heavily. He made his way to the bench and sat down with a sigh. Alone in the autumn afternoon, Miguel's son George tugged his father's sleeve. "Dad, that man looks sad. Should we say hi?" Miguel's heart swelled, the cycle continuing, the lesson passed on. "What do you think you should do?" George considered, then walked over to the bench. "Are you okay, mister?" The elderly man looked up, startled. His face was weathered, eyes tired, but they brightened at the child's concern. I'm managing, son. Thank you for asking. Do you want to see my rock?" "And Dad says it's magic. It has stars inside." The man's eyes filled. "I'd love to see it." Miguel watched his son share the smooth stone, William's stone, passed on now to the next generation, and felt something complete itself. A circle closing, a promise kept, a legacy living beyond death, beyond money, beyond everything except the simple act of seeing another person's humanity. Eleanor squeezed his hand. "He's just like you. He's better. They all will be. That's the point." They walked home together, a family built on broken pieces that had somehow become whole. Behind them, a child and an old man talked about rocks and magic, and how sometimes the loneliest people just needed someone to notice they existed. The cardinal returned to the bench, perched between them, singing its three-note song, and somewhere in the fabric of the universe, if such things were possible, William Chase smiled. What small act of kindness could you do today that might change someone's world? And who in your life needs to be truly seen? Miguel Santos Chase proved that the greatest inheritance isn't money. It's the choice to see others' humanity and act on it. His story reminds us that brief connections can create eternal ripples, that it's never too late to try doing right, and that love sometimes looks like an ordinary morning on a park bench. Every person you pass today carries an invisible story. What if you asked them, "Are you okay?" The world might need your 5 minutes more than you know. True wealth isn't what we accumulate. It's the lives we touch and the trees we plant for shade we'll never sit in.